Thank you so much. I just love hearing all these stories. This is a wonderful place to be on a Sunday afternoon. And I think of my mom too, because she'd be so proud of me, but I also remember one of her teaching was, you have to be humble. Like, you should never brag about yourself. And it's so interesting when you're trying to get a job or whatever. You have to tell people things that you do, but you hear your mother's voice saying, be humble, be humble. So, yeah, so one of the reasons I think that I became an activist is because I was born an Indigenous woman. I was a baby first, but I had a Native mother, and I think that really means something. In Canada, she was born in a little cottage or a little cabin in Fort Chipewyan, and her mother was also born in this community, and my grandmother's mother, so 4 generations of women were born there. And when I think of my mom, she's not that old. She's just, like in her 70s, but her first method of transportation was actually a dog sled. If you can imagine, in 1 generation, how much the life of my family has changed. And I think the other reason, there's numerous reasons, but another reason I became an activist is because for a while, my mother's family lived in a town in northern Saskatchewan called Uranium City. So you can probably guess what that was about. And so I've lived my life as a disabled person as well, as has my sister, and we had a lot of health challenges in our family related to radiation. So one of the things I later learned, I like to do some research and read, and I sometimes get shocked and I become so indignant. But I learned that this little community in northern Saskatchewan and the surrounding area supplied the world with 1/3 of the uranium for the arms race. So you can imagine at that time when my family was living up there and they were fur trading and doing what they do. Also, the American military were up there and they were building roads. And they also were getting a lot of Indigenous people to work in the uranium industry. And so in one community, for example, called Delaney, they had Indigenous workers, mostly men, carrying these sacks of ore from the mines to the boats with their bare hands. And so every single one of those men died. You can see an NFB film about it called The Village of Widows. So ever since I was a little baby, when I started to walk around 1, I started falling down, and my parents figured there was something wrong with me. And then since then, I've had 4 hip replacements. So I can position myself as somebody who has fit into a lot of different categories of, I guess you could say, marginalization, but things that really get you thinking about the world. And when I ended up living on Vancouver Island because at a certain point, my mother left the north and she decided to go to UBC. And I think part of it was, she was a smart woman, but she was also in a little school where there was only maybe 1 or 2 people in her grade level. So she got lots of, tutoring and support. So she decided she was going to go there, and she got a degree in pharmacy, and that's where she met my dad, and they moved to Vancouver Island. But some of the stories she later told me were really sad for me, because she said when she went there, because she was a little bit dark, she would get that white powder makeup like in the 1950s and cover her skin so she looked like a white-skinned woman. Because she didn't want to stand out. And of course, the context of this was that we live in a very racist society, and we still do. So what I learned growing up was you kind of live underground. So you fit in and you get along, but you almost naturally become an activist because you know that something isn't right, and so you do what you can to try to address it without drawing too much attention to yourself. So when I look back, one of my early, activist movements was when I was in school. I would always kind of stick up for the kids that were getting picked on or targeted. And only thinking back as an adult later, I realized those were all Aboriginal kids. They were never labeled as that, but they were the dark-skinned ones, and they were the ones that were in foster care and didn't have any parents. And were just kind of moved through the system, and they didn't really have very many friends. So that was my sort of early role. I became a protector for these kids, but only later did I realize that they could have been part of my family. You know, our families are pretty big, and wherever you go, you know, I often just run into cousins. If you go into a community and you start sharing names, you realize you're really related to a lot of people. And for the mainstream Canadian person, all this goes on underground because Canadians are not really that aware that they're on Indigenous land, and there's just all this history and the way people live. It's not really apparent to you if you're not really aware of the Indigenous communities that are around you. So when I think about my spirituality and how did this really get started for me, I think one of the things was later on in my early work as a counselor and therapist. I had a job at a community agency, and part of my role, it wasn't my job title, but it became the job of helping people, Métis people, Indigenous people, find their families because they had been raised in foster care, often many, many placements. And sometimes they had been adopted, and I don't know if you know this, but for Indigenous kids that were adopted, there was about a breakdown rate between 75% and 95%. So lots of Indigenous kids didn't have a stable home and, you know, ongoing parenting. So I would help people to try to find out where they came from and who their family was. And it was in that process that I really noticed spirit at work, because you can't look at records. You know, there's been a history of bureaucratic secrecy. Many people who've tried to find their history, their genealogy, their family, know that it's really difficult. And if you happen to belong to a church, many churches kept records about baptisms and marriages and deaths. But otherwise, people were really left to their own devices. So we kind of navigate things. But I just noticed that people would say, oh, I just had this feeling, or I had this dream last night, or something just guided me to go here or there. And I just really noticed that there's something at work here when people are trying to live up to their purpose and reconnect and, you know, really root themselves on the land and the land of their ancestors. Something happens. And so for me, part of my own journey in finding out who I was also part of this spiritual path. So, for example, I grew up in a small town on Vancouver Island, and for my whole life there, I just couldn't wait to get out of there. I thought that I just completely been dropped in the wrong place on this earth, and I knew that somewhere I had people. And so I just had to really try to get through. I made promises to myself. I'll finish high school. I won't get pregnant. I won't get tied down here. And then as soon as I graduate, I'm going to find my people. So I did that. I had to work 1 year in a pizza restaurant to get enough money. But I started traveling, and I just went around the world. And at that time, we still had the Soviet Union, and I was interested in socialism. And I had some relatives in Sweden, and I was interested in the sort of Scandinavian version of how to create good societies where people are taken care of, because I thought, geez, where I live, nobody's taking care of anybody, and it just feels really isolating and kind of scary to live here. So I went around the world, and I started in Asia, and I went to sort of indigenous villages there. I went to the Soviet Union 3 times. I was really interested in different kind of political systems. Really, I was looking for places where people took care of each other. I ended up living in Sweden for about 3 years, and on and on. I really covered a lot of ground. And in the end, what I found was that my family was actually in Alberta. Who would have thought? But it was the journey that really just helped me to find out who I was and what kind of community I needed to be, because like the answer to all my questions, I think really is that we need to live in communities of care. And they don't have to be the same cultural group, but we really need to be around people who are intentional, loving, thoughtful, and can take care of each other while all our other systems are breaking down, and where we live in a world where there's a lot of hate. So when I think about something that happened a short time ago, somebody tried to insult me. And they did this by calling me a feminist. And I thought, my God, that's a compliment. Don't they know that's a compliment? But I was really thinking about this and how do you really talk about yourself? And I thought, well, if I really had to, be honest and had a conversation with them, I'd have to say, yeah, I think my right arm is probably feminist and maybe my kidney and my left leg. But I hope that my left arm is a poet and my right ear is a humanist and on. My baby toe is a witch. I'm a whole bunch of things, and we are integrations. And after we learn things, you get into something for a while and you explore, and it just becomes part of who you are. And so certainly concern for social equality has always been in my being. So I'll just share one other thing too, because on this journey, I went and tried lots of things. In the Indigenous teachings and when you're working with young people, the most important thing is to help them find their purpose. And we do that through helping them feel connected to people they love, care for, their community, the earth, nature, whatever it is that gives them the sense that they really belong here. This planet is for everyone. We all have the right to belong. But I was doing all these things and serving other people and doing things where I didn't feel like I was belonging. I was contributing, but I felt kind of alienated and alone. And so one night I was just staying with my friend, and that night when I was sleeping in her guest room, I had a visit, and these were like spirit people. And they came into my room at night and I woke up, and then there's these two people standing at the end of my bed. And they were Indigenous people. And the woman was really scared. She was back in the corner, and there was a guy standing at the end of my bed, and he said, "You have to help us." And at that moment, I started to cry, and I put the blankets over my head, and I said, "Go away." And it took me years to decide, okay, I'm going to go find my people and I'm going to work to make it better for them. And because that's the way I can help myself and my own family. Because the worst thing about racism is that people are talking about your mother. When people say awful things and you just want to say, you cannot talk about my mother like that. So then I became a therapist, and a lot of my work has been in the area, I just loosely call it violence prevention, but right now in Canada, we have a lot of Indigenous women who have been murdered or disappeared. That's what they call it. The official numbers are at least 1,800. But what really causes me outrage about this is that we live in a culture of impunity. And how can you sleep at night and how can you feel good in your own skin when people can do terrible things? And they can get away with it, and we don't always have the power to stop it. And like I said before, many of our systems are failing. So part of my therapeutic approach, working with a few colleagues who kind of share my worldview, we call it response-based practice. So we developed a therapeutic approach that's based on the preservation of human dignity. And I had some tension about becoming a therapist because I don't really believe that we should be individualizing social problems and just taking one person and saying, okay, the problem's in that person, and ignoring what's going on in the social world. So I obviously take an activist stance in my therapeutic work, but there is something really healing and important about giving people time to share their stories and have somebody really listen. So we developed an approach based on talking with hundreds of people who'd experienced some form of violence. And in listening to them and what was important to them and how you structure conversations, it's actually a very simple approach, and I will tell you about it. But it's also developed out of this critique that for years in the psychological field, we have been trying to stop violence by tampering with the minds of the victims. We hurt people, and then we say, oh, because they're victims or because they've been hurt, there's something wrong with them. And I think there's something wrong with that. So what we have to do is keep social problems in the social world and try to address them there. But anyway, in our response-based approach to therapy, first of all, you uphold the dignity of the person. You understand that in trying circumstances, they did the best that they could, and understand that everybody resists oppression all the time in some way. But if you ask them, how did you resist? They'll say, I didn't resist, I couldn't, I was outnumbered or whatever. So we don't ask that question. But basically we ask people, so what happened? Or what was the event? What was done to you? And then we ask them, like, how did you respond? What did you do? So we're putting human agency back in the person. We're not treating them as if they're a passive object, like a lot of psychological theories do when they talk about how people are affected by this and this and this and this. It's just like, what did you do? And basically the implication there is, how did you try to preserve your dignity? How did you try to maintain safety for you or others? So people start feeling really good because they're talking about all their thoughtfulness, their planning, the things they did, the skill at trying to orient. Where's the door? How do we get out of here as quickly as we can? The kind of safety knowledges that are inside people. And then the third part is, who knew and what did they do? So it's sort of like, who did you tell? How did you trust that person? How did you know that was a good person to tell? And this is the crux of the therapy right here, really, because there are so many deniers in the world, whether they're Holocaust deniers, whether they're people that denied or didn't even know that we had residential internment for children, Indigenous children in Canada, and that went on for at least 4 generations. And that, little kids were basically kidnapped from their home. It wasn't a choice, it was the law. And so when you have, if you go to tell somebody, oh, this bad thing happened, and people don't believe you, they think you're making it up, or they accuse you in some way, like they say, well, why were you wearing that short skirt, or all the variations of that kind of victim blaming thing. That's what causes suffering. That's what causes what we can call today post-traumatic stress or whatever. It's not necessarily the initial act of violence, but it's the fact that actually you told people and nobody cared. So in my work with kids, and we talk a lot about bullying today, which I think is kind of that's a really neutral term. I mean, usually bullying is kind of racism or hate or something, sexism, something more specific. We tell kids, tell somebody. If you're getting hurt, tell somebody. But it's so important, because if that little child goes and tells an adult, and this is what happened to kids in the residential schools, they say, somebody's hurting me. If you don't help that child and stop the violence, then that child learns that you're going to have to use violence to help yourself in life because no one else will help you, right? But if we as adults can stop the violence, make that little child safe, teach them that whatever racism is wrong, that adults shouldn't abuse kids, whatever it is, that child has a restored faith in humanity. They trust adults and they believe, yeah, you should talk to people. You should tell people if you need help because they'll help you. And this is a good world. So that is the crucial part of this therapy. And it really means that we need to create, like I said, communities of care and positive social responses to people. We can't just go on saying, okay, if we function the way we're functioning, all we're doing in the therapeutic and psychological world is creating a community of people that we label as being mentally ill, and we're not addressing the injustice in society. So in my work, I've learned that social justice is actually very, very healing. And the final part of the interviewing is then we say, okay, so how did you respond to all these people around you who you went to for help? And you kind of map it out, and then together you, with other professionals or people around them, you create a community where people will actually help and create more safety. And I think that's what we need to do where we live right now in relation to the communities that are being targeted, such as Muslim women or people that can't access services or whatever kind of hate is out there because we don't tolerate it. So I just thought I'd end by sharing this postcard. The AA saying, it's a sort of that prayer, you have to accept the things you can't change. Well, this thing says, I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. I don't know more. Thank you.